on a frozen mountainside where a forgotten house slept beneath decades of snow. A weary rescuer and his scarred dog stumbled into a destiny they never asked for. That winter, as storms rose and lives hung by a thread, the coldest home in Maple Ridge would learn to burn warm again. And so would the man who refused to let hope die. Before we begin, please support us by subscribing to the channel. A thin veil of winter light drifted across Maple Ridge as the season tightened its grip on the mountains. Calvin Hartley trudged through the short stretch of plowed sidewalk leading from his modest one-story house to his truck, boots crunching on brittle ice, Hunter's heavy paws following in a slow, deliberate rhythm beside him. To anyone passing by, he was merely a wiry, almost 60-year-old man fighting the morning chill. But to those who knew him, truly knew him, the quiet, steady way he moved was a remnant of years spent sprinting into burning houses where the air itself tried to kill you before the flames did. Calvin had the kind of face life carved with a blade rather than a brush. Sharp jaw, grooved lines flanking his mouth, salt and pepper beard trimmed close but never perfect, gray-blue eyes always half reading danger, half remembering the past. His skin held a weathered hue, the complexion of someone who had spent more time under emergency floodlights than under actual sunlight. Most days, he spoke little, not because he disliked people. He liked them too much, maybe, but because words tended to sharpen the ache in his chest, where the old memories nested like rusted nails. Hunter padded closer, brushing his flank against Calvin's leg. The German shepherd was 7, his black and tan coat thick and winter-ready, though the faded scars across his shoulders and one torn ear told stories few dogs lived through. Once, a canine unit trained for search and rescue, Hunter had found children lost in rusts, hikers trapped between boulders, and on one brutal night, bodies Calvin was too late to save. The dog's amber eyes held the same quiet weight as his handlers, loyalty mixed with an unspoken apology neither of them deserved to feel. Calvin rubbed the dog's neck, fingers sinking into warm fur. "We're just going to check a house," he muttered, more to himself than to Hunter. Simple job, in and out. But the moment he said it, an uneasy shiver crawled up the base of his spine. He didn't believe his own voice. Maple Ridge was a mountain town with a population small enough for everyone to know which neighbor's truck needed a new alternator or which teenager got suspended for drinking behind the high school bleachers. The town itself sat cradled by slopes that rose like gray knuckles, pines shivering under snow, while the wind played through the valleys like a restless spirit. Calvin had lived here for 9 years. Ever since early retirement pushed him into a quieter life. On his best days, he helped families find warm houses with sturdy roofs, places where laughter could grow again. On his worst days, he lay awake listening to imaginary sirens echoing in the chambers of his mind. The call had come that morning from the county's property office. A repossessed cabin needed inspection before official listing. The locals called it the Frost House, though most said the name only with a shrug or the faintest tremor of superstition. People claimed the house swallowed winter and didn't give it back, whatever that meant. The original owners had left decades ago, leaving behind whispers of a tragedy Calvin hadn't bothered to research. He didn't want the details. He had enough ghosts of his own. The road up Thornback Hill, the hill where the Frost House perched, was barely cleared. the county plow having shoved snow to the side in uneven barricades. Calvin's truck growled against the cold, engine coughing as if reluctant to climb. Hunter sat upright in the passenger seat, one ear tilted, well, one ear that wasn't already half torn, watching the white world blur past. "You feel it too?" Calvin asked after a few minutes. Hunter let out a low, thoughtful woof. "Yeah, should have said no." At the halfway mark, a figure appeared up ahead, waving both arms. Calvin slowed the truck. It was Lyle Merriman, a local handyman in his late 50s who often cleared driveways or patched roofs for spare cash. Lyle was a short, sturdy man with a thick charcoal beard, cheeks reddened permanently from sun and wind, and eyes the color of wet soil, warm but worn down by years of physical labor. He wore a heavy brown coat, speckled with frozen sawdust, as if he never quite managed to escape whatever job he'd left earlier that morning. "Morning, Cal," Lyle called, breath fogging in bursts. "You heading up to the Frost place?" Calvin lowered the window. "County asked me to check the structure. Why?" Lyle scratched his coarse beard, shifting uneasily. "Road sick. And, well, heard some strange noises up there last night. Lights, too." Calvin frowned. "Animals? Maybe. But folks don't usually describe animals as humming." Calvin almost laughed. Almost. "I'll be fine. It's just a house." Lyle hesitated, then leaned closer to the window. "A house don't hum, Calvin." Hunter growled softly, eyes locked on Lyle. The handyman stepped back. "That dog of yours always knows something before we do." Calvin nodded politely and eased the truck forward. Lyle watched them disappear around a curve, expression tight. For a moment, Calvin felt a spike of anxiety stab him between the ribs. Humming, lights, old houses made noises, especially abandoned ones. Loose boards, freezing pipes, rodents. Nothing supernatural. Nothing dangerous. He repeated these facts silently, but they felt thin, like paper trying to stop a storm. As the truck climbed higher, the world around them went silent. Snow muffled everything except the low rumble of the engine. The trees grew denser, branches bending under the weight of white powder. Calvin felt the familiar clench of nerves tightening his chest, the same sensation he used to feel moments before entering a burning building, when your body understood danger before your mind caught up. Hunter suddenly stood, placing his front paws on the dash, ears raised. The dog's posture changed from relaxed companion to disciplined rescuer. Calvin's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "What is it?" Hunter sniffed at the air, tail stiff. A shape appeared through the curtain of falling snow. A cabin, dark against the pale world, roof sagging under decades of frost. The frost house. It looked half asleep, like a creature curled up beneath a white blanket, waiting for something to disturb it. Calvin parked and stepped out, boots sinking into deep snow. Hunter leapt down beside him, nose working furiously. The cabin was larger than he expected, built from thick timbers weathered into shades of gray and silver. The windows were clouded with frost, opaque, like blind eyes. The wooden railing along the porch was crooked, one post having snapped long ago. Something about the place tugged at Calvin's spine, a feeling almost identical to déjà vu, but heavier, older. He approached the front door, testing the warped boards beneath his feet. Hunter stayed close, occasionally nudging Calvin's thigh with his head, as if urging caution. Calvin reached for the handle, but froze. The door was slightly ajar. He was certain the county's record said the property had been locked for years. His pulse quickened, breath condensing in quick bursts. "Someone's been here," he whispered. Hunter's growl rumbled like a distant storm. Calvin pushed the door slowly, hinges groaning. The smell hit him first. Cold dust, damp wood, and something faintly metallic, like old tools left to rust. The interior was dark, but not pitch black. Faint light filtered in through cracks in the boarded windows, falling across a warped floor and collapsed shelf. Calvin stepped inside. Hunter moved ahead, muscles taut. Every instinct Calvin had honed over 30 years screamed that something wasn't right. The cabin felt occupied, not by a person, but by tension itself. As he ventured deeper, his hand brushed the wall, and he jerked back. The wood was warm, not warm like sunlight, warm like breath. Calvin's heart hammered. Houses didn't hum. Houses didn't breathe. But when he stepped farther in, Hunter suddenly stopped, ears pinned, eyes wide. And from somewhere deeper inside the cabin, behind a closed door Calvin had not yet opened, came a soft, unmistakable sound. A whisper. A voice he recognized. One he should never have heard again. "Calvin, you're late." Snow hammered the mountainside in relentless sheets as Calvin Hartley climbed the last stretch of the trail, Hunter pressing close against his leg to brace against the wind. The storm had swallowed Maple Ridge behind them, turning the world into a white, whirling void. Calvin's truck, usually stubborn enough to bully through early winter roads, had skidded sideways on a buried patch of ice and refused to move another inch. He had left it half-turned on the ascent, locked, but leaning as if brooding over its failure. Now, he trudged forward with the stubborn, rhythmical patience of a man who had long ago accepted that the mountain would always win the first round. Hunter, 7 years old, black and tan coat dusted in frost, loped ahead with that quiet alertness carved into every muscle of his loyal frame. His right ear, torn from an old rescue gone wrong, twitched in the wind. Calvin watched the dog pause every few steps, head lifted, nostrils flaring, as if the storm carried more than cold, something faint and uneasy drifting through it. Calvin tried to shake off the feeling. Half the old-timers in Maple Ridge swore that storms on this ridge weren't just weather. They were warnings from something older. He didn't trust mountain lore, but he trusted dogs. And Hunter's growl, low and rumbling in his chest, made the hair rise on Calvin's arms beneath his thick, fire rescue orange parka. 40 more feet. Just a little further, he told himself. And then, through the snow's blinding veil, it appeared, first as a smudge of darkness, then as a structure hunched like an exhausted beast. The frozen house. 2 stories of weather-beaten timber slumped beneath a roof bowed under decades of storms. Its porch leaned to one side like an old shoulder giving way. Windows, 3 of them, glowed faintly with reflected snow, but otherwise stared down the valley like tired, sunken eyes. Calvin had seen hundreds of abandoned properties, but something about this one pulled a thread inside him. Maybe it was the silence, maybe the shape of the roof, reminding him of the house he failed to save all those years ago. Or maybe it was just the way certain places felt too empty, as if waiting for someone who had not shown up. Easy, boy, he murmured as Hunter stiffened again. We're just here for a look. His own voice sounded strange, flat, swallowed quickly by the storm. They reached the porch, its boards groaning under their combined weight. Calvin pushed open the door with a long exhale, and the hinges answered with a moan that felt almost resentful. The interior was a cavern of cold. Wind threaded through the walls as if the house itself were breathing. A cast-iron wood stove sat in the corner under a cracked brick chimney, its surface black and dormant like a heart-long denied fire. Dust covered the floor in soft dunes, disturbed only by the paw prints left by whatever creatures had taken shelter over the years. Hunter circled the room with slow, deliberate steps, his nose close to the floorboards, tail rigid, not frightened, just wary, the way seasoned search and rescue dogs carry their training like a permanent shadow. Calvin knelt by the walls, irritation tightening his jaw. Whoever last maintained this place had given up halfway. There were gaps wide enough to see snow drift through. The roof above the hearth had a sag that made him purse his lips. A house wasn't just beams and boards, it was a promise. This place felt like a promise someone broke. Still, he slipped into the old rhythm, patching where he could with loose boards, shifting a warped chair to block a draft, gathering splinters and old wood shavings from a collapsed shelf. His hands remembered every motion. Fire starting had been part of rescue protocol. Heat kept survivors alive long enough to be found. He stacked the wood inside the ancient stove, flicking open his weatherproof lighter. The flame caught in a small, reluctant wisp. Then another. A breath of warmth bloomed in the iron belly, spreading outward until the stove let out a crackling groan, metal expanding, waking. For one impossible moment, it sounded like a sigh. Calvin sat back on his heels, staring at the orange glow reflecting off Hunter's eyes. There, he whispered, not dead, just cold. Hunter settled beside him, leaning his weight against Calvin's knee. For a few minutes, man and dog watched the stove like it was a fragile miracle. When the warmth crept into the air, Calvin exhaled and let his shoulders drop. But the relief was brief. His pulse stuttered as a memory, sharp as broken glass, cut through him. A burned-out home. A family trapped behind smoke. His boots kicking at a door that refused to budge. The storm that night had roared just like this one, and he'd been late. Not careless, never that, but late. Life had a cruel way of marking its failures on a man's soul and calling them experience. He closed his eyes and let the heat thaw the ache in his chest. Maybe this time, he whispered under his breath, I get it right. They made camp on the floor beside the stove. Calvin wrapped himself in his old rescue blanket, Hunter curled at his side, head resting over Calvin's hip. Outside, the wind clawed at the walls, rattling every loose hinge. The stove kept the worst of it away, but the house still felt tense, bracing, as though it feared the night. Calvin drifted in that fragile space between waking and sleep, the fire's glow flickering on the warped ceiling. And that was when he heard it. A sound no storm could make. A soft thump from the second floor. Not a crack from settling wood. Not the groan of wind. A deliberate footstep. Light. Almost hesitant. Hunter lifted his head at the same moment Calvin did, ears pricked, body rigid, eyes blazing alert. Another thump. Faint. Slow. as if someone, or something, was walking across the floorboards above them. Calvin's breath caught in his throat. The Sahansin house was supposed to be empty, completely empty. Hunter's growl began low, but grew deeper, vibrating against Calvin's ribs. The fire hissed. The wind paused. And from upstairs came a third sound, longer this time, the unmistakable drag of something moving across the floor. Calvin swallowed. Then, very quietly, he whispered, "We're not alone." Morning broke without sunlight, only a dim, gray shimmer pressing through the warped window frames, as if the sky itself were exhausted. Calvin Hartley woke to the uneasy creak of the frozen house straining beneath the weight of the storm. Hunter was already up, stationed near the door, tail low, body stiff. Dogs sensed shifts in weather long before humans did, and this shift carried something sharp, something that felt like warning. Calvin pulled on his cold boots, their leather stiff from the night chill, and took a slow breath. The fire in the cast-iron stove had died some time before dawn, leaving the house as silent as a held breath. He knelt to coax another flame to life, feeling the familiar ache in his knees. Old rescue injuries that never quite healed, especially in the cold. As sparks caught, the wood hissed faintly, steam rising like ghostly threads. He listened to the wind picking up outside, its whistle slipping through the patched seams of the house. "Storm's turning," he murmured. Hunter flicked an ear in acknowledgement, but didn't look away from the door. The radio, an ancient boxy thing Calvin had found shoved behind a loose plank in the kitchen, crackled to life. Through the static came the strained, urgent voice of a local weather reporter, the sound bending under interference. Whiteout conditions, highways shut down, multiple vehicles stuck, emergency crews delayed. Calvin leaned closer, adjusting the dial with a practiced hand. Winds shifting south. Reports of people stranded near Route 12. Repeat, do not attempt to travel. The radio cut, devoured by a wave of static. Calvin closed his eyes for a single moment, pressing the heel of his palm to his brow. Storms like this didn't just trap people, they stole them. He knew that too well. He had been 27 when he lost the first family. A fire in a hillside cabin, blocked roads, a fallen tree. He arrived 13 minutes too late. 13 minutes that had etched themselves into the back end of his mind like a scar carved from smoke. He exhaled, long and steady. This wasn't then. This wasn't that night. He had Hunter now, and he was older, slower, yes, but steadier in the ways that mattered. Hunger nudged his ribs. He rummaged through the backpack he carried everywhere, pulled out a tin of beans, and shared a bit with Hunter, who ate quietly, amber eyes watchful. Through the window, the storm thickened, wind slamming the north wall, like fists demanding entry. Calvin tightened the rope around his parka, old habit, and checked the anchor knots near the door frame. The frozen house moaned in protest as a gust nearly shook loose one of the shutters. "We're not going anywhere today," he said aloud. But the mountain had other plans. Night fell early, far too early. A premature darkness rolled over the ridge, the kind that erased all sense of time. Calvin and Hunter sat near the stove, both listening to the storm's rising pitch. The wood crackled, the windows rattled, and then a sound sliced through the wind, faint, barely there, but unmistakable to someone who had built a life on recognizing desperation. A cry, high, thin, almost swallowed by the storm. Calvin's head snapped up. Hunter lunged to his feet, hackles raised, a low growl pulsing through his chest. "You heard it too," Calvin whispered. He reached for the door, but the wind howled so violently against it that the frame shook. The sound came again, closer now, bending through the storm like a plea. It wasn't an adult's call. It was smaller, breaking, frayed at the edges. A child. Calvin felt something inside him tighten. Something painful, old, familiar. For one heartbeat, he hesitated, not out of fear for himself, but for what stepping back into that role meant. He had promised himself he was done trying to outrun ghosts. But some promises were meant to be broken. He grabbed the heavy safety rope he kept looped beside the door, wrapped it around his waist with the efficiency of muscle memory, then secured the other end to a thick porch column he had reinforced earlier. "Hunter," he said softly, "with me." The dog pressed close, ready. Calvin pulled his scarf over his mouth, braced himself, and shoved the door open. The blizzard slammed into him like a living thing. Icy claws, a scream of white and wind. Snow hammered his face, stinging like sand. He leaned forward into the storm, gripping the rope, step by grinding step. Hunter moved ahead, nose to the gale, pulling gently, guiding him like a living compass. Their world narrowed to whiteness, rope, breath, and urgency. The cry came again, closer but fainter, as if the wind were trying to bury it. Calvin cupped his hands around his mouth. "Hello! Call out again!" Silence. Then, barely audible, a sob. Hunter veered right, dragging Calvin through the chest-deep drifts. And there, half hidden in the storm's throat, a shape emerged. A yellow school bus, tilted, frozen, its side half buried in snow. Calvin's heart dipped. A school bus meant children. He pushed forward, boots sinking helplessly, until Hunter circled, barking with rising insistence. Behind the bus, nearly lost against the snowbank, were two small bodies huddled together. A teenage boy, maybe 14, with tousled dark hair crusted with ice, skin pale and lips trembling. He had that wide-shouldered but not grown look, the awkward, still-growing frame. He shielded a smaller figure, a girl no older than 7, tiny, with blonde braids stuck to her face by frost, her blue coat ripped along one sleeve. Her eyes fluttered as Calvin knelt, checking her pulse with fingers trembling from more than cold. The boy tried to speak through chattering teeth. We got off the bus. It wouldn't start. We tried to walk. She fell." Calvin put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Firm, steady. The teen winced. Calvin immediately noticed a swollen ankle, likely twisted in the snow. "You did good," Calvin said quietly, but with a conviction that made the boy's eyes wet. "But you're not walking anywhere on that." Hunter pressed against the children, curling his body to transfer warmth. The girl stirred faintly, burying her face in Hunter's fur. Calvin shrugged off his parka, ignoring the shock of cold, and wrapped it around both children. "We're going back," he said. "Stay close. Do not let go of me. Understand?" The boy nodded. Calvin took the girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, frighteningly light, and guided the boy to hold the rope with him. Hunter led, breaking a path in the storm. Every step felt like pushing through memories he never wanted but somehow needed. Snow piled on Calvin's shoulders. Ice burned his cheeks. But ahead, The faintest golden pulse from the stove's glow flickered through the cracks of the frozen house. When they stumbled inside at last, the door slammed shut behind them, shutting out the roar of the storm. Heat hit them like mercy. Calvin lowered the girl by the stove and pulled blankets over both children as Hunter curled protectively around them, radiating warmth. The boy sobbed once, more relief than fear, as his sister's breathing steadied. For a long moment, Calvin just stood there, chest heaving, staring at the children, feeling something inside him loosen for the first time in years. He had gone back into the storm. And this time, he had not been too late. The cast iron stove glowed orange, its warmth spreading through the room like a quiet blessing. Calvin knelt beside the kids, touched Hunter's head, and whispered, "Good boy." Hunter's tail thumped once, soft, proud, and then, from the upstairs hallway, a soft, deliberate creak, one that did not belong to wind. Calvin froze. The children slept. Hunter lifted his head, ears sharp, eyes narrowing. The creak came again, slow, intentional, as if someone was taking a careful step toward the stairs. Calvin stared at the darkened ceiling. "Not now," he breathed. The house answered with silence so heavy it felt like a held breath waiting to break. The storm finally broke with a weary sigh, leaving Maple Ridge draped in the pale hush of a morning that felt half frozen and half born anew. Calvin Hartley stepped onto the porch of the frozen house, boots sinking into powdery snow that glittered under a shy sun. Hunter padded beside him, nose twitching at the scents washed clean by the storm. Down the ridge, the distant growl of engines drifted upward, rescue vehicles crawling up the mountain road now that visibility had returned. Calvin cupped his hands around his mouth and waved when he saw the flashing lights bobbing like red fireflies through the trees. Within an hour, the rescuers, 2 deputies and a paramedic, had lifted the 2 children into warm blankets, checked the boy's swollen ankle, and driven them away down the hill toward their frantic families. Calvin watched the truck disappear until its taillights blinked out behind the drifting white. A hollow quiet settled into the space it left behind. He should leave too. That was the sensible thing. His job had been to inspect the property, snap a few photos, confirm its structural decay, and report back to the Maple Ridge Realty office. He had done far more than that. His duties here, professionally, were over. But when he walked back into the frozen house, something in the air felt altered. Not warmer, not safer, just aware. As if the house had finally woken after a long, exhausted sleep. Hunter trotted around, sniffing with renewed curiosity. Calvin felt a tug of something familiar yet unnameable. He pushed it aside and began gathering the things he'd scattered the previous 2 days. Ropes, tools, emergency blanket, the half-used tin of beans. His movements were efficient but slow, dragged by a weight he couldn't quite define. Every few seconds he paused, glancing up the stairs. Last night's creaks echoed in his mind. Not the wind, not the settling wood, something deliberate. But daylight made bravery easy, and doubt even easier. "Probably nothing," he muttered. Hunter gave him a look that said he wasn't convinced. Calvin knelt to coil the safety rope when a sudden clicking sound, sharp but tiny, came from near the stairwell. Hunter's ears perked. He trotted over and began pawing at a crooked plank beneath the bottom stair, claws scraping wood. "What is it, boy?" Calvin walked over, heart ticking faster, half expecting a loose mouse or a bundle of dropped nails. But the board wiggled under his fingertips. Not broken, loose. Too deliberately placed for an accident. With a careful tug, he pried it free. Dust puffed out, followed by the metallic glint of something tucked deep inside a shallow cavity. A tin box, rectangular, dented on one corner, the kind that once held cookies or sewing needles in a different century. Hunter stepped back, tail swaying with growing interest. Calvin lifted the box gently. It was cold and surprisingly heavy. "Well," he murmured, "looks like this house still has something to say." He carried it to the stove, where the fire he had kindled that morning now hummed steadily. The metal warmed under his palms. When he finally opened it, he found inside a bundle of folded papers. Yellowed, edges browned, ink faded to soft shadows. Letters, diaries, handwritten pieces of someone else's life. Calvin sat slowly, almost reverently, on the wooden floor. Hunter settled beside him, chin on Calvin's leg, as if sensing the gravity. The first letter was addressed in looping ink. "For whoever finds this house next." The handwriting belonged to someone with steady hands, someone who had once written often. Calvin unfolded the page. The words bled through decades, but the emotion still clung to them. Winter, 1933. The ridge is cruel this year. We've taken in 5 wanderers since December, farmers who lost their land, miners left with nothing but hope worn thin. My wife still cooks soup for anyone who knocks, even when our cupboards grow bare. She says a house that closes its door stops being a home. Calvin paused, throat thickening. Hunter nudged closer. He kept reading. "Our boy, Samuel, says we cannot help everyone, but he helps anyway. Always running down the ridge to guide strangers through storms. Always too brave for his own good. Last night, he went out before the worst hit. He has not returned." The next lines were jagged, darker, as though the writer's hand had trembled. "We searched. God knows we searched. The snow swallowed his tracks. We fear he is gone. This house feels different without his laughter. Empty in a way walls cannot mend." Calvin swallowed hard, chest tight. The memory of his own failure, the family he hadn't saved, flashed like a wound touched by cold fingers. He read on. "We leave this home to the mountain now. If, in some far tomorrow, someone finds a way to bring fire back to this hearth, we ask only one thing. Do not keep its warmth only for yourself. Let this house breathe again. Let it shelter those who wander. That is all we ever wanted for it." The letter ended without a signature, but the weight of the words was more than enough. Calvin closed his eyes, feeling a heat rise behind them that had nothing to do with the stove. He picked up another page, this one written in a feminine hand, softer, rounder. "My husband tries to be strong, but our boy was the best part of him. This place, our refuge for strangers, feels haunted now, not by spirits, but by grief. If someone reads this, be kinder than the mountain was to us. Give this place a chance to be good again." The papers trembled in Calvin's grip. Hunter pressed his head into Calvin's ribs, a gesture of comfort the dog had learned in the darkest days of Calvin's recovery. "They lost their son," Calvin whispered, "and they kept helping people anyway." He stared into the fire. Flames licked upwards, soft and steady, like small hands reaching for reassurance. A house that closes its door stops being a home. He had come here to inspect a property, to tick a box, to leave. But he had opened the door for two terrified children and lit a fire to save strangers in the storm. Without meaning to, he had already stepped into the legacy written in these pages. Maybe that was why the house had felt different since last night. Maybe that was why he couldn't seem to walk away. The frozen house didn't want a realtor. It wanted a guardian. Hunter lifted his head suddenly, ears twitching toward the hallway, as if he sensed Calvin's thoughts forming, gathering weight. "Easy," Calvin told him, running a hand over Hunter's scarred back. But inside, something settled, a decision old as grief itself. He folded the letters with a care that bordered on reverence, placed them back into the tin, and looked toward the window, where the snow glowed orange in the late afternoon light. "We're staying," he whispered, "for now. Someone has to keep the fire going." Hunter's tail thumped once in quiet agreement, and above them, in the shadowed rafters of the second floor, a faint creak echoed, soft but distinct, like the house acknowledging his choice, or warning him. Word traveled fast in Maple Ridge, faster than any radio broadcast, faster than the plows that cut paths through the snow. Within a week, stories spread of a once-dead cabin on the ridge now glowing with firelight, a tired old house awakened by a man with gray in his stubble and shadows behind his eyes, and a scarred German shepherd who patrolled the floors as though guarding an outpost on the edge of the world. Some called it foolish, others called it fate, but everyone agreed on one thing: the frozen house was open again. The first visitor arrived at dawn 2 days after the children had been rescued. Calvin had been outside splitting firewood, his breath hanging in the frigid air, when he saw an 18-wheeler truck skewed sideways on the mountain road, its wheels buried in snow. A man climbed out, a large figure in his late 40s, with a broad chest, a face cut by fatigue, and a salt-speckled beard. His name was Buck Larson, a long-haul driver with shoulders like boulders and a limp in his left leg from an accident years earlier when his truck jackknifed on black ice. He was gruff, not out of rudeness, but caution. Life had taken too many swings at him for small talk to feel natural. "Engine's freezing up," Buck muttered, rubbing his gloved hands as he approached. "Heard a rumor some fella up here keeps a fire going." Calvin nodded, motioning him in. Buck hesitated at the threshold, surprised perhaps by the warmth, or perhaps by Hunter, who eyed him sternly before deciding he posed no threat, and trotted off to check another corner of the room. Calvin poured the man a steaming mug of instant coffee, and Buck accepted it with both hands, as though it were something holy. He barely spoke the whole hour he stayed, but when he left, he clasped Calvin's shoulder with a silent weight of gratitude that said everything words could not. The next day, a thin woman in her late 50s appeared on the porch with an infant swaddled against her chest. She introduced herself as Mabel Green, a widow with wind-chapped cheeks, weary brown eyes, and dark hair streaked with silver. Her old sedan had spun off the road near the ridge, and she'd walked the last half-mile through knee-deep snow with the baby in her arms. She was small, barely reaching Calvin's chin, and though she tried to speak confidently, her voice trembled with exhaustion. Calvin helped her inside, stoked the fire, and offered the warmest blanket he had. The baby, a chubby-cheeked girl with soft curls the color of corn silk, soon fell asleep on Hunter's flank, the dog lying perfectly still so as not to disturb her. Mabel watched the scene with eyes brimming, whispering, "No one's been this kind to us since my husband passed." Later, an older miner named Gideon Pike arrived. He was a wiry man in his 70s with leathery skin, a crooked nose, and hands permanently stained with coal dust from decades underground. He walked with a makeshift crutch, just a sturdy branch, and explained that the storm had caused a rock slide near the old mine road. One of his legs had been struck by falling debris. His pain was clear, but so was his stubbornness. He insisted he could keep going until Hunter nudged him firmly toward the fire. Gideon finally relented, sitting heavily by the stove, muttering that even a fool knows when a dog outranks him. Each of them left by the next morning when plows cleared the road, but their stories spread throughout the valley like migrating birds. Soon the frozen house became a whisper of refuge, a lighthouse without a lantern, but with a flame that never went out. Yet not everyone approved. On the sixth morning, as Calvin stepped outside to check the weather, a county official drove up the ridge. Deputy Supervisor Lawrence Holt, a stern man in his mid-50s with a hawkish nose, neatly combed graying hair, and a distrustful gaze that seemed carved into his bones. He was the kind of bureaucrat who believed rules kept the world from falling apart. He had seen too many disasters caused by people meaning well. Holt stepped out of his SUV, clutching a thermos and a clipboard. "Mr. Hartley," he began, tightening his coat against the cold, "we've received reports that you've been sheltering stranded citizens." Calvin folded his arms. "If someone's freezing out there, I'm not turning them away." Holt sighed, clearly anticipating resistance. "Look, I respect your charitable instincts, but this structure isn't certified as an emergency shelter. The county can't assume liability, and there are geological concerns. The ridge is unstable during temperature swings. You could be held responsible if anything happens to the people you let in." Calvin's jaw tightened. He'd been responsible for lives once. Too many, in fact. And he'd learned long ago that some responsibilities were worth any cost. "I'm not running a business," he replied evenly, "just keeping people alive." Holt's expression softened for a moment, as though he understood more than he let on, but his training smothered any sympathy. "Be careful, Hartley. Help people, sure, but don't get yourself buried under the weight of something you can't control." With that, he left, tires crunching through snow as he descended the ridge. Calvin watched him go, unease creeping under his skin like cold seeping through old insulation. Hunter whined low, ears flicking toward the distant valley. Something felt off, wrong in a way Calvin couldn't yet name. That afternoon, a warm breeze rolled through the trees, unsettling the icicles that hung like fangs from the gutters. The temperature climbed quickly, unnaturally, and Calvin felt the shift like a pressure change before a fire flashover. His instincts screamed caution. He decided to take Hunter down the path that wound toward the narrow river below. The dog's posture changed the moment they neared the tree line. Ears pinned, tail stiff, body lowering as though approaching a threat he could neither see nor ignore. When they reached the frozen riverbank, the air carried a metallic tang. The ice, once smooth and silver blue, now bore a jagged crack running through its center. Water pulsed beneath it like a living thing demanding to break free. Calvin knelt, touching the surface lightly. A cold tremor vibrated under his fingertips. Hunter barked sharply, stepping back. "Yeah," Calvin murmured, scanning the valley. "Doesn't look good." Above them, thin plumes of meltwater trickled down the rocks. Harmless now, but a warning of what would come if the heat persisted. Sudden melts caused flash floods in mountain towns. He'd seen them sweep away entire neighborhoods back when he worked rescue lines. As they climbed back toward the frozen house, each step felt heavier. Calvin knew he stood at a crossroads. If the melt worsened, the ridge road would become a trap. People could die trying to flee. Standing on the porch, Calvin looked toward the valley, where the cracked river curved like a wound across the land. He had been entrusted, by accident or fate, with a house meant for wanderers, a place meant to hold life against the storm. A place that once lost a child, but never stopped wanting to save others. Now, another danger approached, silent as thawing ice. Hunter pressed against his side, tail unwing, gaze fixed on the valley. Calvin exhaled, long and slow. "Looks like the mountain's asking us to choose again, boy." The wind shifted, warm and unsettling. Somewhere below, the river moaned, low, deep, a warning pulled from the earth itself. And Calvin Hartley understood that the storm they'd survived was only the beginning. The first warning came as a shudder beneath the floorboards, soft at first, like the house clearing its throat, then swelling into a deep groan that rattled the mugs hanging above the kitchen counter. Calvin Hartley froze mid-step, breath held. He had heard that sound before, long ago, in a burning building where the beams sighed moments before collapsing. Hunter rose from his corner bed, hackles prickling, amber eyes locked on the dark window. Another tremor came, then a crack, sharp, violent, ripping through the valley like the scream of something ancient. Calvin snatched his coat from the peg and burst onto the porch. Below the ridge, the frozen river he'd inspected the day before was no longer frozen. A jagged black vein of water tore through the ice, widening by the second. The flood surged across the open fields, devouring drifts of snow, upending fences, and carrying away abandoned sleds and old farm equipment like toys. The moonlight caught the debris, turning it into shimmering shards, carried by a hungry, swirling current. Hunter stepped beside him and lifted his muzzle. The howl that slipped from the dog's throat was long and grieving, a sound that seemed to rise from the heart of the valley itself. Before Calvin could speak, Hunter sprang down the slope, paws flinging snow behind him. "Hunter!" Calvin bolted after him. His boots slammed against the icy ground, breath tearing at his chest. The dog led him toward the lower ridge where an old trailer lot sat, a cluster of mobile homes used by seasonal workers, people who rarely had the luxury of sturdy roofs and warm walls. Calvin knew some of them by face. Quiet folks, private, too proud to ask for help. But now their homes were ringed by water. When he reached the last stand of pines, he saw the scene clearly. Floodwater swirling around the mobile homes, creeping up the steps, slamming debris against the thin aluminum walls. Faint voices cracked through the storm. Fearful calls, short and desperate, like birds trapped in a storm drain. For a heartbeat, Calvin was thrown back into the past. Smoke, a burning roof collapsing, a child he reached too late. Not again. He planted his hands against a birch trunk until the memory loosened its grip. When he breathed again, it was steady, present, determined. He scanned the lot. A rope. He needed a rope anchor. He found a massive pine whose roots clenched deep into the earth and began securing a thick nylon line stored in the emergency box he kept in the cabin, one of the few habits from his past life he'd never abandoned. As he worked, Hunter sniffed the air, then plunged into the flood. Calvin cursed and followed the dog to the shoreline. Suddenly, he spotted a floating glove, small, pink, bobbing among the ice. Hunter seized it gently in his mouth. Then the dog turned, paddling toward a figure clinging to the steps of a mobile home. A girl no older than 8. Her black hair plastered to her face, her eyes huge with terror. Beside her, a woman, likely her mother, held on to the railing with trembling, whitened knuckles. She was in her early 30s, short and slight, with round cheeks drained of color, dark curls tucked beneath a wool beanie, and a voice that cracked each time she tried to call for help. Calvin reached them by wading through waist-deep water so cold it stabbed like knives. "Take my hand," he shouted. Hunter reached the girl first. The child latched onto the dog's collar, sobbing. The mother tried to wade toward Calvin, but slipped. He lunged, catching her by the arm. "I've got you," he said, tightening his grip until her panic eased. "We're going to the ridge. Stay behind me and hold the rope." Calvin secured the lifeline and guided them step by agonizing step as Hunter swam beside the child, nudging her to move forward whenever she faltered. The water clawed at their legs, dragging debris past them with vicious force. Twice, tree limbs slammed into Calvin's side, but he forced himself on. The mother stumbled, but clung to his coat. Hunter barked encouragement, a sharp, urgent rhythm that seemed to keep the girl anchored to hope. By the time they reached the slope, where the rope tightened into safety, Calvin's fingers had lost all feeling. He hauled the mother and daughter up the incline and onto firm ground. The woman collapsed against him, sobbing into his coat. "Thank you. Oh, God, thank you." Hunter shook the water from his coat and nudged the girl with his nose, licking her cheek until she giggled through her tears. But the night was just beginning. Calvin looked down at the trailer park, still dotted with lights, still echoing with cries. More families were trapped, a dozen at least. He sprinted down again. Hunter followed, limping slightly now from the cold's assault, but refusing to stop. The hours that followed blurred into a frantic symphony of motion and instinct. Calvin secured the rope over and over, tying knots with trembling hands. Families crossed one by one. An elderly man with sun-leathered skin and tangled white beard who leaned heavily on Calvin's shoulder. 2 brothers in their 20s, both broad-shouldered and exhausted, one limping from a sprained ankle. A middle-aged woman with freckles and frizzy red hair who clutched a cat carrier against her chest as though it held her last piece of the world. The cat inside, a large orange tabby with one torn ear, clearly older and half-blind, hissed at the storm, but quieted whenever Hunter passed, perhaps sensing a kindred survivor. Calvin moved with a command he knew too well, barking instructions over the roar of the wind. Hold the rope with both hands. Keep your bodies angled upstream. Move when I tell you. Inside the frozen house, he arranged survivors in a tight circle around the stove, stacking blankets, passing mugs of water, directing people as though orchestrating a rescue unit. He knew exactly how long a shaking body could withstand cold. He remembered the signs of hypothermia from training long ago. At one point, a gust of wind slammed into the cabin, rattling it from foundation to roof. A few people jumped. Hunter whined, tail flicking anxiously. Calvin steadied the nearest support beam with his hand, whispering, "Not tonight, not like before." He worked until his voice turned hoarse. He made 3 more trips down the ridge, pulling family after family through the flood. Once, a trailer wall collapsed and water rushed in like a beast unleashed. For a moment, Calvin thought he'd lost the 2 teenagers inside, but Hunter had darted forward, teeth gripping the sleeve of one and dragging him toward the rope until Calvin could grab the other. Near dawn, the storm shifted. The flood slowed. The water, though still swollen, began to recede. In the cabin, 30 people huddled in the warm, golden glow of firelight. Some whispered prayers, others wept. A few simply stared at the walls, as though trying to memorize the feeling of safety. Calvin counted heads. 27 adults, 3 children, all alive. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, chest burning with fatigue. His coat was torn, his hands scraped raw. Then he noticed Hunter lying near the stove. The dog's right leg bore a deep cut, probably from debris in the water. Blood matted his fur, but his eyes were calm, steady, settled on Calvin with a loyalty that dared the universe to challenge it. "Hey, partner," Calvin murmured. He knelt, gently inspecting the wound. Hunter winced, but did not pull away. "You scared me tonight." Hunter's tail thumped once. The cabin groaned again, but this time it was softer, almost like an old man settling into his chair after a long, harrowing night. Smoke drifted peacefully from the chimney. The house stood, battered but unbroken. Calvin exhaled. Relief washed over him like warm water. For the first time since the river cracked open, he let himself sit. Around him, the rescued families murmured softly. A few offered quiet thanks. The children, exhausted, pale, wrapped in blankets, slept leaning against their parents. Calvin closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic breaths filling the room. No one was missing. Hunter was injured, but alive. And the house, this stubborn, creaking house, had survived a trial of flood and fire all over again. The morning after the flood felt unreal, as if the world had been scrubbed clean and left shivering in the pale winter sun. The snowbanks glistened like shards of broken glass. The fields shimmered under a thin crust of frost. And the frozen house, Calvin's stubborn, creaking refuge, stood like a survivor who had refused to bow. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, warm and steady. Inside, the last of the rescued families packed their few belongings, whispering to one another with the reverence of people who had spent a night brushing against the edge of darkness and lived to speak of it. By noon, news vans clawed their way up the ridge in a lurching parade. Their tires skittered on the icy dirt path, their antennas swinging like awkward metal antlers. A petite woman in a red winter coat, dark hair cut into a sharp bob, skin pale from too many hours under fluorescent newsroom lights, tripped out of the lead van with a microphone in hand. Her name was Melissa Crane, a well-known local reporter in her late 30s whose quick wit and bold questions had earned her a reputation for stirring trouble with a smile. Today, though, she approached with a softness Calvin rarely saw in the media. Perhaps the sight of the battered house and the exhausted survivors sobered even her lively spirit. "Mr. Hartley," she said, extending a hand gloved in black wool. She was shorter than Calvin, maybe 5'4", with a slightly fox-like face, sharp brown eyes that missed nothing, and a voice that balanced crisp professionalism with a thread of warmth beneath. "I heard you ran a rescue operation up here last night. Is it true you saved nearly 30 people?" Behind her, a cameraman, tall, bearded, with wind-burned cheeks, and a heavy green parka, raised his equipment expectantly. Calvin rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable under the attention. "I didn't save anyone," he said quietly. "The house held, and Hunter did the rest." At the sound of his name, Hunter padded forward. His injured leg was bound in clean bandages, but his gait had regained most of its confidence. Snowflakes clung to his black and tan coat, and the faint notch in his right ear caught the sunlight like a badge of honor. Melissa knelt instinctively, eyes softening. "Is this your partner?" "He's the reason anyone's breathing today," Calvin replied. Hunter sniffed Melissa's hand once, then nudged it, which drew a small laugh from her, light, like wind chimes in frost. The cameraman filmed it all. Within an hour, the small clearing outside the house turned into a makeshift press circle. Reporters interviewed the families who stayed the night. An elderly miner with a braided white beard, the two young brothers still shivering under loaned blankets, the red-haired woman hugging her cat carrier as though keeping a piece of her soul safe. But it was the little girl Hunter had saved, Emily Rowan, 8 years old, with delicate features, brown, eyes like polished chestnuts, and cheeks flushed from the cold. Who became the star? When Melissa asked what she remembered, Emily hugged Hunter's neck and whispered, "He looked like a giant shadow in the water. I thought he was an angel." Hunter blinked, confused by the attention, and rested his head on her shoulder. The reporters nearly melted. One van began broadcasting live from the ridge. Another snapped photos of Calvin standing beside the house, looking every bit the weathered guardian with his tired eyes and frost-stung cheeks. For once, he didn't shy away from the camera. He felt he owed that to the people the house had saved. The crowd thinned by late afternoon. Survivors left in escorted vehicles, the cabin finally exhaling in the sudden quiet. Calvin leaned against the porch railing, thinking the day had finished surprising him, until the crunch of slow footsteps sounded behind him. He turned. An elderly woman, bundled beneath a long beige wool coat and a thick fur-trimmed scarf, approached with a measured grace. She was small and thin, with silver hair pinned neatly under a knitted hat and a pair of round spectacles perched at the end of her nose. Her eyes, pale blue, almost translucent, studied the cabin with a mixture of awe and sorrow. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, voice frail but clear. "Not at all," Calvin replied. "Can I help you, ma'am?" She hesitated before answering. "My name is Eleanor Tate. Well, I suppose I'm the last living relative of the couple who built this house." Calvin stared. The cold suddenly felt thicker. Eleanor continued, drawing a folded envelope from her coat. The paper was yellowed and soft at the edges, held with the tenderness one reserved for relics. "I saw the news. Saw the journals you found." Calvin nodded. He'd kept the pages safe, slipped them carefully into clear sleeves, each word treated like fragile bone from a life long faded. Eleanor's breath quivered. I read their letters so many times when I was a girl. They they stopped writing when their son died. I never knew what became of the land. She looked down at the envelope. But this is something they left behind. She handed it to Calvin. Inside was a brittle document bearing the signature of the original owners. An old transfer deed, never filed, never completed. The ink faded, but the words unmistakable. The house and ridge were to be given freely to whoever tended the flame when we no longer could. Calvin's chest tightened. Ma'am, I didn't do anything special. Eleanor shook her head slowly, the motion delicate as a leaf stirring in wind. You made their house warm again. You gave shelter as they once did. And you saved lives. She lifted her eyes, shimmering. They would have wanted it to be yours. Calvin swallowed hard, unable to speak. Hunter nudged his hand as if urging him to breathe. News of the deed spread through Maple Ridge within a day, faster than falling snow. Neighbors and strangers alike appeared at the ridge with paint, lumber, canned food, blankets, tools, anything to help repair and transform the frozen house. A retired carpenter with shoulders like stacked logs offered to rebuild the porch. A school teacher volunteered to organize donations. A local mechanic repaired the generator free of charge. A mother dropped off knitted hats for any traveler who needs one. And Hunter, his limp nearly gone, became a legend. Children came to pet him, each instructed by Calvin to be gentle around his healing leg. But Hunter, always patient, leaned into their tiny hands, tail wagging like a slow metronome of reassurance. Parents retold the story of how he leaped into the flood. Someone carved a small wooden plaque, Hunter's rope, the night we lived. Calvin mounted it beside the door. Within a week, the house had a new name across the beam above the porch, Hartley Haven. The letters were carved by the miner Calvin had helped rescue, his hand still steady despite a lifetime of swinging pickaxes underground. One evening, as crimson twilight fell across the valley, Calvin sat on the porch with Hunter pressed against his leg. The house glowed behind them, the fire crackling, windows warm gold, murmurs of laughter inside as volunteers finished sorting supplies. Calvin breathed in the cold air. It no longer smelled like fear. It smelled like pine smoke and warm bread and neighbors arriving through the snow. Hunter lifted his head, pressing it into Calvin's hand. You took me farther than I ever planned to go, Calvin murmured. Guess this house wasn't the only thing that needed fixing. Hunter exhaled a soft, contented sigh. And in that moment, under the rising stars, with the flames of Hartley Haven flickering like a promise, Calvin realized the truth he'd run from for years. The fire that once hollowed him out had finally been met by a greater flame, one that warmed instead of devoured, one that opened rather than destroyed. His heart, once scorched and shuddered like the frozen house, had learned to burn again, steadily, openly, for others. In the end, the frozen house was never just wood and nails, nor merely a shelter on a lonely ridge. It was proof that sometimes God works quietly, through ordinary people with wounded hearts, and through loyal creatures who cannot speak yet understand more than we do. Calvin thought he had lost his purpose years ago, but the night the flood came, the Lord placed him exactly where he needed to be. And through Hunter, his four-legged messenger, the door to mercy opened again. Everyday miracles are rarely loud. They don't always blaze like lightning or thunder across the valley. Most of the time, they look like a warm light in a cold night, a hand reaching out in the storm, or a tired man choosing kindness when fear tells him to turn away. God does not leave us lost. He whispers direction, nudges our steps, and sets gentle guardians beside us, sometimes in the shape of a faithful German shepherd. If this story touched your heart, may you remember, whenever you light a fire for someone else, the Lord lights one within you. Whenever you open your door to a stranger, heaven opens its doors a little wider for you. And whenever life feels frozen and heavy, trust that God can thaw even the coldest places, homes, roads, memories, and hearts. As you finish this story, I pray that God blesses you and everyone you love. May He guide you, protect you, and send a little miracle your way this very week, whether through a kind word, a stranger's smile, or the quiet courage to keep going. If Calvin and Hunter's journey warmed your spirit, please take a moment to share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with your favorite moment. Subscribe so you won't miss the next uplifting tale. And may the Lord watch over you, now and always. God bless you. God